Rachel Axon, USA Today Sports. Pyeongchang, South Korea. For 4 years, Russia systematically doped its athletes. It covered up positive tests, and rather than police its athletes, the Russian anti-doping agency helped them cheat. The Ministry of Sport directed a system involving hundreds of athletes. For 16 days, its athletes competed under an Olympic flag, the name Russia still on their chest, albeit smaller and in a different shade of red. As the Pyeongchang Olympics closed on Sunday, the Russian Olympic Committee remained suspended. But to many, a yawning gap remained between that sanction and a vast system of doping, one whose existence was accepted by the International Olympic Committee, World Anti-Doping Agency and others. Regardless of what you may hope, you can't merely wish away the most significant fraud in the history of sport, the Institute of National Anti-Doping Organizations wrote to the IOC before the end of the Games. A transgression of such magnitude warrants a proportional sanction which must go well beyond an irregular attendance at the Pyeongchang Games and paying a fine. By failing to impose a meaningful sanction on the ROC, the IOC would be culpable in this effort to defraud clean athletes of the world. More, or hockey team sings banned Russian anthem Armor. IOC's decision on Russia shows its doping stance is a fraud at its most basic. Anti-doping sanctions have two aims: punishment and deterrence. Individual athletes caught doping often serve a period of ineligibility, which is typically 2 or 4 years, and return prize money or medals. Add to that the stigma of being labeled a drug cheat. Those suspensions are also meant to deter athletes from doping in the first place, though that effect is difficult to measure. Yet in the case of Russia's system of doping, anti-doping officials and athletes find the IOC's response lacking on both fronts. When the IOC put in no meaningful consequences, the Russians are laughing at the rest of the world, said Travis Tygart, CEO of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. They know they got away with it, and they're continuing to try to get away with it, or at a very minimum being extremely careless and not really caring if they win by cheating or not. Without such clear guidance on how to address systemic doping in place, the IOC had to formulate its own response to the revelations of Russian doping. That came in the form of a December decision in which it suspended the Russian Olympic Committee while allowing individuals to compete as Olympic athletes from Russia. The suspended NOC still helped put forward names from which the IOC issued invites for the AW team. Its vice president, Stanislav Potsnyakov, served as the head of the delegation. The IOC ultimately invited 168 athletes to compete here, and they claimed 17 medals, including golds in women's figure skating and men's hockey, the two events Russia prizes most. To be sure, the IOC excluded those implicated in doping in Sochi, where Grigory Rodchenkov, the former Moscow lab director turned whistleblower, swapped their tainted urine for clean samples by passing bottles through a hole in the wall. The Court of Arbitration for Sport overturned the sanctions the IOC attempted to levy in 28 of those individual cases, restoring 9 medals the IOC had stripped. Russia lost 2 gold medals in bobsled as the CAS upheld sanctions in 11 other cases. The IOC might still appeal the cases it lost, and none of the athletes who appealed to the CAS competed here. The whole scheme was designed not to be caught and for individual athletes never to be detected, Tygart said, and for the IOC to attempt to justify their unwillingness to have any sort of backbone and hold the organizations that are responsible, the state, the ROC, the individual federations, is only that much more of a farce when very few individual athletes have been held accountable. And likely never will be held accountable. Despite vetting the athletes the IOC did invite, the Olympic athletes from Russia still accounted for half of the 4 positive tests here. Both athletes, curler Alexander Krushelnitsky and bobsled Nadezhda Sergeyeva, quickly admitted to doping. Krushelnitsky returned the bronze medal he won in mixed doubles curling. A group implementing the IOC sanctions found those violations were not part of a system, but they were enough to keep the ROC suspended and the Russian flag out of the closing ceremony. The suspension is expected to be lifted this week if AW has no more positive tests from these games. It's clear that the methods they used were systemic throughout the Russian team, across a broad array of sports, and they've really paid very, very little in the way of punishment for that. U.S. biathlete Lowell Bailey said after his final event here, "I honestly think Russia hasn't gotten the message. It's clear that they haven't gotten the message because they're still, after all that's happened with the IOC, they're clearly still willing to push the limits and break the rules and cheat. It's those concerns that are causing Bailey and the U.S. biathlon team to join the Czech Republic in boycotting a World Cup in Russia next month. While it's not under the IOC's purview, it's the International Biathlon Union that has resisted calls to move the event. It speaks to a mistrust athletes still feel about Russia's place in sport. It's a really difficult situation as an athlete to know that these offenses have occurred and that they've drastically affected medals, and not only medals, but even who was able to participate in the games, said U.S. bobsled pilot Alana Myers-Taylor, noting that in Sochi the Russians qualified 3 4-man sleds while the Americans had just 2. I feel like there's been a loss in faith of the athletes in these games, of all games, because of the offenses that have occurred. So the more of us who are clean will go out there and say, hey, we stand for clean sport, the better we're all gonna be. For his part, IOC President Thomas Bach said athletes' voices have been heard, with a representative of the IOC Athletes Commission on the Implementation Group. But many around the world continue to speak out publicly, and anti-doping officials worry the IOC's response will embolden other countries. Clean athletes continue to raise concerns and are understandably frustrated with the equivocal stance of the IOC when it comes to the systemic doping in Russia, INADO said in its open letter. WADA President Craig Reedy, who is also an IOC member, said it's important that the IOC took a decision to sanction the only one that it could, The Rock. I would hope that other countries, having looked at the experience, would wish to avoid this situation at all costs, he said. Yes, Russia has been marred in this. Its medal count here will not count toward its historical total. Several officials have been replaced within its sport and anti-doping systems. Bach says the sanction that kept Russians from competing under their flag here was fair and appropriate. But for a system of doping as brazen as has been seen in sport, The Rock could end up serving a suspension of less than 3 months. That's left many questioning if the IOC's response fits the severity of Russia's misdeeds. I don't think, quite frankly, that these Olympic Winter Games have been tainted by the Russian affair because we had no Russian team here, Bach said. This was a clear message. Yes, it absolutely was. Just not the one the IOC thinks it is sending. Contributing, Jeff Calkins.